Welcome to the Hawley Local History Society. Tonight's presentation is the Agincourt campaign of Henry V in 1415, presented by Doug Cox. Please visit www.hawleyhistory.org.uk for more information.
So we're going to talk about the Agincourt campaign of Henry V. Now, this was part of a series of battles between England and France, which collectively was known as the 100 Years' War. Well done. Anybody know why the 100 Years' War started? Can anybody say why exactly it was fought? Okay.
Because we hated the French. Yes.
Well, that was just a byproduct of it. But I'll do my best to explain exactly how it came about, because although this happened many years before the period we're going to talk about mainly, it is interesting and it's important that you understand how it happened. This is, as you can see, the royal line of France, and this problem began.
Doug, if you don't speak into the mic, you lose your...
This problem began when Charles IV of France died. Now you can see from these dates that his older brothers had been kings of France, but when Charles IV of France died, he didn't leave a son. Edward III of England was the child of their sister, Isabella, who had married Edward II. And because he was thus so closely related to the last King of France, Edward III thought that he should be the rightful king to succeed Charles IV. And that was the nub of the issue. In the event, it was decided that Isabella couldn't bequeath the crown of France to Edward III because she had never possessed it herself. So the French did what they still do, and they went backwards through the family until they found another guy living, and the crown of France passed across to Charles of Valois, Philip of Valois, and then to John. And Edward III had got the raging hump because it didn't pass to him. And that, in essence, is why the 100 Years' War started. This is just a resume of what I've just told you. And you can see at this time, the British, or Edward III, ruled over the Duchy of Aquitaine. Now that's the area in southwest France, around the area of Bordeaux, as we know it today. And Edward III had to pay homage to the French king for this duchy, but because he got the hump about the crown, he stopped paying. And I mean, when we say paid homage, he paid obedience to the French king. So he decided he wasn't going to do that, and the French king's response was to confiscate what was left of the English-held lands in Aquitaine and Gascony, and that is what precipitated the 100 Years' War. In 1346, Edward III invaded France, took the port of Caen, and carried out a pillaging raid across northern France. And on hearing that Philip IV was raising an army to stop him, he turned north towards Calais, and when he reached the forest of Crécy, he dug in and waited for the French. And although they outnumbered the English, they felt foul of the English longbow, and the battle ended in a decisive English victory, and the French suffered heavy losses, but Edward went on and captured the port of Calais, which became an English possession for the next 200 years. In 1355, his son, Edward the Black Prince, invaded again, and he landed at Bordeaux, while his kinsman, the Duke of Lancaster, landed in Normandy. And this time they were opposed by King John II, and he forced a successful action against the Duke of Lancaster and turned southwest to catch up with the Black Prince who was coming up from the Bordeaux area. And they met at Poitiers, and again the British army was vastly outnumbered. The Black Prince offered to return the loot that he'd plundered during his march, but King John refused and decided to take them on, and they forgot the lessons of the Battle of Crécy and were again defeated by the archers. The important thing here was that King John was captured and he was held prisoner by the English for an enormous ransom. So the agreed ransom for him was 3 million écus. Now, this is a French sum, which isn't familiar to us. And because of the variations across France, dealing with financial matters in écus and gold crowns and God knows what, this forced the French crown to combine all their monetary values, and this caused the first minting of what we knew as the French franc. And as a guarantee for the payment of the ransom, John gave an enormous number of people as hostages. 2 of his sons, princes, inhabitants of Paris, and 2 citizens from each of the 19 principal towns of France. And in 1360 or thereabouts, Edward III finally retired to England. But if you look at this map, you can see there the area around Calais, which the English owned and governed, and this huge area in Gascony and Aquitaine, which the British king governed. And when you look at that, you can see that, we all know how empty France is when you drive across it. The probability is that the population in here wasn't far short of the population in the rest of France. So it's quite finely balanced. Unfortunately, this treaty broke down because King John's son, Louis of Anjou, escaped. Now, in this age of honesty, chivalry and honour, this was a huge no-no. And because his son had escaped, King John felt honour-bound to return to captivity in England. And he died there in 1364, and his son succeeded him as Charles V of France. Then in 1369, on the pretext that Edward III had failed to observe the terms of this treaty, the French declared war again. By the time of his death, the English forces had been pushed right back close to their territories around Bordeaux. And this treaty didn't lead to a lasting peace, but just gave about 9 years of relative peace between England and France. And at this time, the coat of arms of Edward III was the fleur-de-lis of France and the lions of England. And this was an indication that Edward maintained his right to the crown of France equally with his right to the crown of England. So when Edward III died, his only son was the Black Prince, and the Black Prince had predeceased him. So it was the Black Prince's son who came to the British throne, aged 10, as Richard II. Now, obviously at that age, he couldn't govern, and it was the brother of the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, who was the Lancastrian element in the family, who had the real power with this young king. Nevertheless, when he was aged 14, he was faced with the peasants' revolt, led by Wat Tyler, who was eventually killed, and Philip, although very young, he showed great bravery when confronting these rebels. And he wasn't interested in fighting for the French crown, and he concluded a peace with France which lasted 28 years. But eventually he became something of a selfish king, and he was careless of the support of the nobles throughout the country. No different at that point to Boris Johnson when he loses the support of him and him and him. And it was inevitable that he was going to be in trouble. And in 1399, he made the mistake of leaving England and going to Ireland. And Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, who was in exile in France at the time, saw his opportunity, nipped over to England, raised an army and deposed Richard II, and eventually he starved him to death in Pontefract Castle in 1400. And I'll show this slide just to give you a flavour of what people were wearing at this time. You can see the king here, Richard II. I think this guy probably looks like the Archbishop, but one of these chaps standing very close to him must have been John of Gaunt. And there's a picture of the coronation of Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke. So he was the first king to speak English as his first language. He was the grandson of Edward III. In his time, he'd been a great soldier. He led armies to Lithuania, to the Holy Land, and after he deposed Richard II and took the crown in 1399, he survived several coups by the major lords and earls in the land, and in 1403 he defeated the Lancastrian ruling family, the Percys, at Shrewsbury. Now this is interesting because his son, who was to become Henry V, had been pretty much schooled by Henry Percy in the art of warfare. And during this battle at Shrewsbury, Henry V, as he was to become, was in a very powerful position. He actually, although he was only about 15 or 16, he commanded the right wing of his father's army, at Shrewsbury. And while doing that, he actually took an arrow through the right side of his face, quite close to his nose, and it was only through the skill of the king's surgeon that was eventually removed. But if you see portraits of Henry V, you'll only ever see the left side of his face, so it must have left quite a scar. So Henry IV died at Westminster in 1413, and throughout the back end of his reign, as his health declined, Henry, his son, had become more and more powerful. And by the time he became king, he was a very powerful man and well respected in his own right. And immediately he came to the throne, he renewed his claim to the French throne. And that's the story behind Henry V and how he came to the throne. He was quite a simple man. He would eat whatever was put in front of him. He didn't have any great airs and graces. To some extent, he was a man of the people, and he was a meticulous ruler. He took a hand in everything and pretty much had his finger on the pulse. Now, at this time, Charles VI in France was only 44, but he was unhappily married, and whether it was that drove him mad, we don't know. But this was the king of France who thought he was made of glass, and he went through periods where intermittently he was absolutely raving balmy, and then for the next 3 months he'd be perfectly lucid and normal, and then a bit later, he'd be round the bend again. Now, because he was thus such a weak king, there was a bit of a squabble going on between the noble houses of France, particularly between the Dukes of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans. But this also involved the other major dukes in the French kingdom. Now, Henry V knew at this time that he was going to have to go to France and fight for the French crown. And to some extent, he was duplicitous in his negotiations. He had negotiations going with all these various families in France. So he knew that however they eventually paired up, he would get into bed with one of the families and have their support. And while these negotiations were going on, he proposed marriage to Charles VI's daughter, Catherine, I think she was Catherine of Valois. So through all this period, he was paving the way for the invasion of France that he knew would come. Now, Shakespeare wrote the play Henry V, and I watched this the other day. One of our older members, who can remembers this coming out in 1945, and all the children at schools in Hawley were given the day off to watch this film of Henry V that Laurence Olivier made in the closing year of the war. But when I read this passage from Shakespeare, I think he's got this part of it absolutely right, because he says here that all the youth of England are on fire. They're not worrying about their fine clothes. They're sorting out a better sword or better armour. And they're starting to think, well, if I can get to go to France, what honours might I win? What riches might I bring back? And he said, Harry and his followers, the French, advised by good intelligence of this most dreadful preparation, shake in their fear, and with pale policy seek to divert the English purposes. Now, I think this is generally pretty much how it was, because Henry had put the fear of God into the French. They knew he was coming and they were frightened. If we look back at the last few years before this, you can see that the French had been nibbling away. They'd aided the Welsh rebels under Owen Glendower, and the population of England knew that negotiations were going on with France, and they were ready to believe that the French were duplicitous. But Henry V was doing his share, and he was preparing for war while he was talking peace. And don't forget that this is the age when chivalry and knightly honour were almost at their height, and all the knights and men-at-arms, they could all feel what was coming, and they were pretty much champing at the bit to go. But he had to raise money, so he sent his commissioners right through the country, raising money from every source they could. And some of these loans were less than voluntary. But you can see some enormous sums here by the standard of the day. The City of London gave £32,000, the church gave £9,000, and the bishops themselves gave £44,000. Richard Whittington, turn again Whittington, Lord Mayor of London. So the Lord Mayor of London lent £2,000.
That was a lot of money, wasn't it?
It was an enormous sum of money. But look at what he's got to pay for. He's got to pay for 1,500 ships. So he's called in all the Jews from the St. Ports. He's taken every available ship, probably along through Holland and the north coast of Europe. Look how many horses he was planning to take, because every duke was allowed 50 horses, an earl 24, and every knight could take 6 horses. And we're going to talk a bit in a moment about this division of ransom monies, and I'll come to that. In fact, I'll do that. I'll do that now. But he issued contracts not just with the captains of the ships, but he issued contracts with every knight and nobleman who pledged to bring men-at-arms and archers to this fight. And these contracts were quite incredible. I put this up here just to show you the length of it. And don't forget, this had to be issued and given to every knight, every nobleman who was coming on this expedition. I was going to read off this bit of paper, but it's probably easier for me to read off the screen. The important thing here, he says, this is the actual contract he made with a chap named Simon Felbrigg. Now that's a name who we don't know from Adam. It isn't somebody who's come down in history as somebody who's familiar. But he says here, the said Simon shall have with him on the said expedition 12 men-at-arms, counting him with the same, 36 archers, taking for his wages 2 shillings a day. And in the company of our Lord the King, the said Simon shall travel towards the above kingdom of France. He shall take 12 pence for the wages of each of the said men-at-arms, 6pence a day for each of the above said archers, and in the event of the said expedition to France, he shall take 100 marks for 30 men-at-arms per quarter. So he goes into details about what he's going to pay to every knight and every nobleman. And he goes down here, because he hasn't got enough money. And he says, and for the security of payment, the king shall deliver to the said Simon, as wages, those jewels which, with the agreement of the said Simon, shall be valued at the same sum as the wages. So Henry V has broken up the crown jewels and every other jewel he can lay his hands on, and he's given them as surety across the country against his promise to pay this money. And furthermore, this part down the bottom here details exactly what's going to happen if Simon Felbrigg or one of his archers takes prisoner anybody from the French side who's worth ransoming. And it goes into great detail here. And it says, and if it happens that the king's French adversary, the French king, or any of his sons, nephews, uncles or cousins, or if it happens of the lieutenants or other captains having the authority of the king's adversary, our lord the king shall have his said Simon, or him who shall have captured them, the king shall have a third of the spoils of the said Simon, as well as the third part of the spoils of the men of his revenue gained on the above expedition. So, you know, the king is going to get his money back from the taking of the prisoners and the ransom that he expects to get for them. So this is the sort of contract which went out to everybody in any sort of authority who was going to accompany the king on this expedition.
Would the people have been educated sufficient to understand all of that?
Well, the people who the contracts were issued to would certainly have been relatively well educated, and I don't think it mattered whether they could understand it or not. They were going to accept it or pay the consequences. And this is the retinue roll for Simon Felbrigg, and this shows the list of men he was contracted to bring. So don't forget that this had to be done for every knight and every nobleman. And what it lists here are Simon Felbrigg, the men at arms, probably the hangers-on, and then the archers that this guy was going to bring with him. And this would have been replicated for every nobleman who came on this expedition. Now, I've already said that Henry V was very careful. So he arranged that the principal knights who weren't going on this expedition were instructed to make arrangements for the protection of England while the king was away. A night watch was instituted for every town, and innkeepers were forbidden to allow strangers to stay for more than one night. And the king's brother, the Duke of Bedford, was appointed Lieutenant of England with a council of defence to secure England while the king was away. And all this time, Henry V is maintaining contact with the French, and the French heralds are coming backwards and forwards to England with answers to whatever Henry has proposed. And you can see in July 1415 the French offered many important villages and towns and the hand of Catherine with 800,000 gold crowns. And Henry told the French delegation to depart, and that he would quickly follow them, and if they weren't careful he'd be in France before they were. So he left them in no doubt that he was coming. And it was during, I think, these exchanges between both the sides that the French bought Henry V supposedly a gift of tennis balls. And I think that probably annoyed him as well. So, towards the end of July, he wrote to his cousin Charles, the King of France, for the last time. He said, "In the name of the merciful bowels of Jesus Christ, to do us justice." And despite his use of such flowery language, he knew that in 2 weeks' time his fleet would be ready to sail. So early in August, Henry said his prayers and made his offerings at St Paul's and made his will, and he travelled down to Porchester Castle, just above the Solent. I think Pam and I were there a few months ago. And on the 10th of August, my birthday, if anybody's interested, Henry boarded the Trinity Royale and ordered the ships to take up position to sail to France. Don't forget, we're talking about 1,500 ships here. And 3 ships caught fire and had to be abandoned. But at 3 o'clock on Sunday the 11th, the fleet, with drums beating, trumpets blowing, and priests praying, with about 12,000 men, we think, sailed for France. And this is the sort of ship that most of them would have sailed in. Some bigger, some smaller, but this is pretty much what they look like. And sailing from Southampton, they pretty much followed the route of cross-channel ferries that we take now, from Portsmouth to Le Havre. And sure enough, the next day they arrived off Harfleur. Now, I'll show you the exact location of Harfleur, but those of us who've gone on that cross-channel route, we tend to land at Le Havre, get onto the road as quickly as we can, and drive down towards one of the bridges to move south into France. When we do that, we pass Harfleur after about a 10-minute drive on our left. So Harfleur sits very close to Le Havre, and Le Havre, of course, didn't exist in these days. And I'll show you this town on a map in a second, but it was quite a prosperous town. Importantly, it was surrounded by a high wall, 2.5 miles long, with 26 towers. And in terms of a medieval attack, I mean, it was quite a difficult town to get hold of. As you can see, only 3 gates gave access, but Henry needed this port so that he could resupply his supply column. And as soon as he landed, he held a council of war, although he already knew pretty much what he was going to do. And before dawn the next day, a patrol under Sir John Holland and Sir Gilbert Umfreville, Sir John Cornwall, went ashore to see what was going on. Now this is the location of Harfleur. This is Le Havre, and I don't quite know what the layout of the land here was in 1415. I suspect that this dock would not have been here, and that this, which is the mouth of the river, was probably all one landlocked area. But there was a river which flowed down here through Harfleur, and that probably came right down here to the sea. So this is what Harfleur looked like. Here you can see the 3 main gates, 1, 2 and 3, with all these little castles all the way around the walls, and a large lake at the front with a chain stretched across it. This is Harfleur today, and if I flash backwards and forwards between the two, you can pretty much see it, can't you? Here's the southern bit, and those are exactly the walls of Harfleur. This, in 1415, would have been quite a sizable ditch. So this is what it looked like then, and this is how they set up camp, with King Henry in this area, and the Duke of Clarence up here, and several swampy areas all round the town. So immediately Henry V sent his heralds into the town and said, look, I've got an army here, you better give up. And the guy in command was this Sire de Estouteville, and he rejected the call to surrender, even though the garrison was less than 100 men. But fortunately, just before the English completely surrounded the town, another 300 men arrived at Harfleur, and they were commanded by this chap, Sire de Gaucourt, and he was an experienced soldier, and he took over the command from this chap. So Henry V immediately laid siege to the town, and they did have guns, but they were in their infancy at this time. So the English tried to mine under the walls of the town, and the French skillfully countermined them. So they sort of negated the British tunnels. And the English began to build gun platforms, but because they weren't close up against the walls of Harfleur, every now and again the gate would open and 30 odd men on horses would come out, and they'd demolish these gun platforms and dash back through the gate before the English could do much about it. So this was quite a time-consuming procedure. But nevertheless, Henry eventually bought up 12 enormous guns. Look at the size of the stones they're going to fire. I mean, these weren't metal cannonballs. These were enormous shaped stones. And when one of these hit the walls of the town, it would have really rattled it. And it didn't take too many in one place to do some severe damage to Harfleur. And plus the fact they were still also using arblasts and bricolets to chuck stones and burning material into the town. And I'll just give you a flavour of what the men-at-arms looked like. I mean, this is what armour looked like in those days. These two, or certainly this one, is wearing a material coat of arms. Now, they didn't wear these all the time. This was essentially their uniform. The armour was their protection. And depending on how much money you had, armour could be quite incredibly heavy. If you could only afford a relatively cheap suit of armour, that was heavy. If you had a lot of money and could afford the very best German or Italian armour, then that was lighter. But even a light suit of armour was extremely heavy. And these men had to be very, very fit to be able to move and swing a sword or raise a shield with this type of armour. And I want you to give some thought as well to these style of helmets. Obviously, when they went into action, they pulled the visor down. And at that point, their vision was incredibly limited. Now, I don't know if anybody here has ever put a saucepan on their head and then had somebody bang it. But it leaves you weak at the knees, and I just can't imagine what happened, even when one of these helmets got a really good blow with a heavy sword, or God forbid, a battle axe or a mace. And this is the nub of one of the problems which we'll come to later on. Because if you knock this man down, he struggled to get up because his armour was so heavy. And here you can see the archers. Just going to say a few words about the longbow. The longbow at this point has been around for quite a long time. It doesn't bear any resemblance to the sort of bows that you will see somebody shooting with on an archery range today or at the Olympic Games. These bows are between 5 and 6 foot long. When you see a competition bow today, it doesn't require an awful lot of power to draw it back, and it's drawn back to the eye, and the stave of the bow has a sight on it which the archer uses to line up his target. Now, these bows didn't have anything like that. So these men, these professional archers, practiced so much that their upper bodies were pretty much deformed because of the power, the weight that was needed to draw this bow. As I said, the smaller bows you see used today are drawn back to the eye. These were drawn back to the ear. And you didn't aim this bow, you sort of felt the arrow go into place, a bit like when you see a really good darts player. There's nothing for him to aim at or to aim with. He just feels the dart onto the dartboard. Well, these archers were exactly the same. Obviously, if they were shooting at a guy 20 yards away, that's point blank. But when these guys open fire at 300 yards, they just feel the arrow. They know exactly how much elevation they've got to give it and how much power they've got to put into it. But the power needed to draw these bows was enormous. When they were on the move, the bow was never strung. So the bow would just be like a straight piece of wood. It was notched at the ends, usually with something like ivory or some very hard wood. And the bowstring, which was the important piece of the equipment, when it was not on the bow, it was usually in the archer's hat, where he put it to keep dry, and he would certainly have spare bowstrings with him. So the most important part of the archer's equipment was his bowstring, because without that, the rest of his equipment was useless. Now, this particular picture shows archers wearing armour. All the evidence at this time at Agincourt was that they probably didn't wear any armour at all. They were lucky if they had anything more than a cloth or leather helmet. They certainly didn't wear metal helmets and metal breastplates like these chaps do. So, Henry V has laid siege to Harfleur, and he's gone over there in August, and it was hot. It was very hot. They were camped in a swampy area. There were lots of flies. They didn't have enough fresh water, so the water they drank was tainted. They were drinking muddy water. They were eating dirty seafood, cockles, mussels. Some of us think all seafood's dirty. My wife doesn't. They'd also got access to grapes which weren't properly ripe, and cheap local wine. And the net result, after a very short while, was dysentery. And it didn't take very long before all men, whether they were nobles, whether they were men-at-arms, or whether they were archers, or whether they were the Fletchers or Bowyers or king's tent makers or all the hangers-on, they just began to die. And those that didn't die were dreadfully, dreadfully sick. But on the 17th of September, don't forget that's a thick end of a month after he's landed, the English finally captured the Barbican at the Lure Gate. But the town refused to surrender, whereupon Henry gave orders for a most severe bombardment. And he knows that the French army is in the vicinity, but he doesn't know exactly where. And there was an arrangement made between Henry and the garrison in Harfleur that if the French army didn't appear and relieve them, then they would surrender on the 22nd of September. And the French army, whether they knew exactly what was going on or whether they didn't turn up. And as a consequence, Harfleur surrendered on the 22nd of September. Now this is a problem for Henry because so many of his men and archers have died that he's reduced to only about 5,000 or 6,000 archers. He needs around 1,000 men to garrison Harfleur, and he actually sent out a challenge to the Dauphin to resolve this whole quarrel by personal combat between the two of them, bearing in mind that Henry was a fit and experienced soldier, and the Dauphin, the son of the King of France, was not. However, that was rejected by the French, and again, although Henry had made up his mind exactly what he was going to do, he held a council of war on the 5th of October, and because the army was so weakened, he decided that they couldn't advance towards Paris, and they had no alternative but to make their way up to Calais and try to return to England from there. Many of the ships that he'd arrived with had to take sick men and some of the dead noblemen back to England, and some of the other ships were going up the coast towards Calais. So Henry V, knowing that they were going to march through France, he thought to himself, well, I know what this lot will do if they get near a French village. I mean, the first thing they'll be looking for will be the women, and the second thing will be the wine, and the third thing will be anything worth taking that they can get in their pockets. So he gave express orders that there be nothing compelled, nothing taken from the villages, nothing taken but what we pay for. None of the French upbraided or abused. And he said, when lenience and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentle gamester is the soonest winner. So he laid down in the language of the day exactly what was expected of his men when they marched through France. So when they set off, the Duke of Clarence has already gone back to England, taken many men with him. And about the 8th of October, Henry began the march north towards Calais. Now, at this time, he'd got more horses than he'd got men. So we don't think that the men were marching. Most of them were on horses. But they were still suffering dreadfully from dysentery. And if you believe some of the history that's been written, a lot of them were travelling, and if they had trousers on at all, they'd got to drop them so often, they simply found it was easier to cut the bottom out of them. So I leave you to imagine the state of this army when they set off. So they set off along the north coast of France because they knew that there was a ford at this place, Blanchetaque. Sir John Cornwall set off with the vanguard, with Gilbert Umfreville, the main body led by Henry V, and the rear guard led by the Duke of York. And Richard de Vere, before he got his part into the man of Ball, was also commanding the rear guard. And this, if you know the north of France, this is Abbeville. So the Somme goes out to the coast from here. And this was the area of Blanchetaque. So it was quite a way. The coast is over here, and it curves around here and comes in. So this Blanchetaque fort was quite a long way inland. And what Henry had done, he'd sent a messenger via the ships that went to Calais, telling the commander of the Calais garrison to send 600 men down and meet him at Blanchetaque. And when those men got there, they found that a huge column of the French army was north of the Somme and exactly opposite the ford. Not only that, they put stakes in the ford to make it difficult to get across. So Henry looked at this and had to decide what to do. And he had three options. He could either try and force the ford with a weak army. He could either return to Harfleur and try and get his men away on the boats that were left there, or he could march inland in search of a crossing. And this is what he chose to do. So here's the River Somme coming inland from the coast, and as Henry V and his men marched along the south bank, the huge block of the French army simply moved along the north bank. So whether they found a ford or not, there was no way they were going to get across. But when he reached this area here, by Corby, he must have received some intelligence which led him to understand exactly the geography of the course of the River Somme here. And somebody must have given him information that there were fords in this area that might have been crossable. So if you look at this, when you consider the body of the French army that's over here, they have got to march all the way round this curve, whereas Henry cut across country and so stole a march on them and got to this area long before the French did. And it was during this period that one English soldier was caught stealing from one of the village churches, and he stole a small silver box which contained the bread from the Eucharist. And although this was supposedly only made of copper, the thief had probably mistaken it for gold, and it cost him his life because Henry V had him hung in full view of the rest of the army as an example of what would happen if you stole from the French or disobeyed his orders for the march. So he managed to cut across country and found two fords here and here, quite a long way apart. And he sent part of his army across one and part across the other. And on the 20th of October, 3 heralds arrived in his camp with a message from the senior French dukes and from the Constable of France, who was effectively the commander-in-chief of the army. And Henry said to them, I haven't come over here looking for a battle. And they said to him that if he'd like to name a place where he would care to fight them, these 3 French princes would fight him and decide the outcome. And although Henry received them ceremoniously and honourably and rewarded them with generous gifts, he then sent 2 of his own heralds to tell them that since leaving Harfleur, he had striven and was striving daily to reach his realm of England. He was not hiding himself away. So if the 3 princes of France wished to fight him, it was not necessary to pick a day nor a place. For every day they could find him in the open fields without difficulty. And at this point, he knew that the battle would come fairly soon. So the men-at-arms resumed their full armour and were granted permission to wear their coats of arms, which would identify them on the battlefield. He sent out scouts well in advance, and he instructed all his archers to cut down heavy defensive stakes which they could knock into the ground in front of them to deflect any French attack. And the baggage train was tightened up, well defended. By this time, the good weather, which had caused him all the problems with the heat at Harfleur, had turned, and it was raining the whole time. So not only were these men still fearfully sick, they were wet, underfed, and they were miserable. And here you can see exactly what happened. Henry had landed here at Harfleur, and unbeknown to him, the French army were at Rouen. And as soon as it became obvious that Henry was going to head for Calais, they went round the loop in the Somme and took up a position in this sort of area here. Whereas Henry came up to the ford at Blanchetaque, and then he followed the Somme down to here before he cut the corner and managed to cross at the two fords down here. So as they passed in this direction, they've arrived in this point eventually about here. And every now and again they cross the track of the French army. So they got a really good idea of how large it is. And it's pretty obvious that they're looking for, or they're looking at, 20 or 30,000 men. And eventually they go down into a steep valley at a town called Blangy. And the scouts brought news to the king that a French army was only 3 miles away on the other side of the river. But the ford at Blangy was not defended, so Henry gave orders to proceed with all possible haste. And it was too late in the day for a battle that day, because these people didn't believe in fighting at night, and the armies eventually camped about a mile apart. Now, if the history is to be believed, the French had many fires, so the British could see clearly, the English, I should say, could see clearly the sort of army that they were facing. But Henry sent out spies in the night, so they had a really good idea of the French numbers. But don't forget, it had been raining really constantly for the last few days. Very similar circumstances to the Battle of Waterloo, which was fought 400 years later. So on the following day, clearly less than 6,000 men are going to take on 30,000. And this is the speech from Shakespeare, which we're all familiar with. And whether Henry said exactly this, I don't know. But the histories are all agreed that he said something very similar. And I think it quite likely that he said to the men, we don't need more, we've got enough. And in a few years' time, when people talk about this day, men will be sorry that they weren't with us here, because tomorrow we're going to earn a great victory. He must have said something very similar to this. Now, many years ago, I've never been able to resist a battlefield. And with my wife and daughters, I tried to find Agincourt. And we knew we were very close, but every bloody Frenchman we asked denied all knowledge of it. Now, we don't speak good French, but when you say Agincourt or Agincourt, usually these days they know enough to say, well, it's that way. And the reason they don't know anything about it is because this history has never been taught in French schools. So the French people have no concept of this at all. And eventually we found our way there. But this is what the area looks like today. There's a very small, it's not really a town, it's almost a hamlet here, and much the same over here in a village called Tramcourt. Historically, this green area surrounding both was forested, and it was much more heavily forested than you can imagine. You can see the residue of trees here, so you can imagine that 800 years ago it was very heavily forested. And the English came up this road, and when they got into this area they could see the French over here. So they abandoned their baggage train in this little village, or close to this village, of Massoncelles, and posted a few men to guard it. And then Henry brought his army up into this position, and they laid themselves out in three, what in those days were called battles. And King Henry was in the middle, the Duke of York on the right, Lord Carmoy's on his left, with archers on the flanks, and possibly archers between each battle. And they hammered their stakes into the ground, and they waited. And this area between these two woods, this was ploughed fields, and this had been raining constantly for several days, and these fields were thick and heavy. If you know the soil in this part of France, it's heavy, red, clinging soil. This is the sort of stuff that men fought through in the Battle of the Somme. And Henry stood here, and they waited, and nothing happened. So eventually, they picked up their stakes, and they went a couple of 100 yards further forward until they were in arrow range of the French army. Now, the French army was very poorly disciplined, and these noblemen here were clamouring to be in the front rank. They were on horseback, and they were fighting almost to be at the very front for the honour and glory. And the French didn't have archers, but they had crossbowmen. And the crossbow didn't have anything like the range of the longbow. So eventually Henry is set into this position, and still the French do nothing. And eventually Henry ordered the archers to open fire at long range, and these guys could fire 5 arrows a minute. And they don't think of them as having arrows in a quiver. They probably simply had them stuck in the ground in front of them. So they were doing that, and so there was a hail of arrows going across into the French army. And that was the provocation for them to charge. And as they charged down here, the ground got heavier and heavier and heavier. And the reason men charge on horses in these days into battle was because they would charge through anything that stood in front of them. But by the time the horses got down to here, they were absolutely knackered and could barely put one foot in front of another. And the archers simply poured arrows into them. If the rider went down, he couldn't get up. And if he made it as far as the English line, the guys on either side were so close to him that they couldn't swing their swords, they couldn't use proper lances, so most of them had cut down their lances to make them shorter. And the net result, when the French got into this area, was just absolute chaos. As soon as a knight went down, an archer nipped out and stabbed him through the visor, or simply hit him on the head so hard with a mace that he was never going to get up again. And by midday, the battle had started, and although the English line took a bit of a knock, it didn't give. And they reckon that within a very short while, the pile of French dead in front of the English was higher than a man could see over. And don't forget, when these mounted knights went down, if they fell off their horse, the horse didn't hang about, the horse galloped backwards, straight into the path of the other knights who were trying to come forward. And the whole thing was absolute chaos. And as I say, they reckon that within an hour, the wall of French dead was higher than a man's head. And 18 French knights, who were eventually all killed, had sworn to take the crown from Henry's helmet. The Duke of York on his right was killed. And the English took so many prisoners and sent them back to where the baggage was, that there were more prisoners at Maisoncells with the baggage train than there were Englishmen in the line. So when the English have stopped this initial advance and the French have sort of pulled back to draw breath, it appears to Henry that they're forming up for another assault. So Henry couldn't afford to have them come again. He needed all his men in the line to resist them, and that left him nobody to guard the prisoners. So he said, kill the prisoners. Now this has been used to sort of paint Henry in a very poor light ever since. But it's difficult to see what else he could have done, because the French peasants have already been at the baggage. They've stolen gold and silver and jewels and one thing and another. And he ordered that the prisoners were killed. And in fact, some of the archers were quite reluctant to do that, because these prisoners represented the ransoms, which, although they'd got to share it with their immediate leader and with the king, these were the ransoms that were going to make them rich. Nevertheless, most of the lower ranked prisoners were killed at this point. So the renewed assault eventually didn't happen. And they reckon around 10,000 French died. Almost every noble family in France lost several men. And the English casualties were something of the order of 100. And most of those were wounded. And by the middle of the afternoon or end of the afternoon, Henry V summoned the French herald. He would have sent his own heralds to find him and say, come and see the king. And the French herald conceded that Henry had won the battle. And Henry said, what's the name of that chateau or castle I can see over there? And the guy said, that's Agincourt. And Henry said, well, this will be called the Battle of So the dead were stripped of their armour, and everybody loaded themselves up with as much loot as they could possibly carry. The bodies of the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk were boiled and stripped so that the bones could be taken back to England. And eventually 3 huge pits were dug to take around 6,000 bodies. And I think probably for weeks afterwards, the French peasants were roaming across the battlefields, lifting anything of value from the dead noblemen that were still laying around. And eventually Henry marched on to Calais, got there on the 29th of October, and by this time they were so short of food that many of the prisoners were simply sold off fairly cheaply to buy food and drink. And eventually Henry reached Dover on the 16th of November and finally reached London, where the news had already arrived, and he arrived there on the 23rd of November. And this gives you some idea of the fuss that was made of him when they arrived in London, and there were several gates and that done up like this as he walked through. But he walked through very humbly, he didn't make a fuss. And it said the king was dressed in a purple robe and with a serious countenance and a reverend pace. He walked through the people and gave thanks at St Paul's, and eventually rode back to the Palace of Westminster, escorted by his citizens. Now I'm just going to tell you a little of what happened after the Battle of Agincourt, because Henry finally returned to France in 1417, and he made an arrangement with the king that he would marry Catherine, the king's daughter, and that Henry V would become the king's heir in France. So the king decided or agreed that in effect the Dauphin, his acknowledged son, should be declared illegitimate. So at that point, Henry V was to be the next king of France. But unfortunately, he died in 1422. He was aged just 34, and undoubtedly he was England's greatest soldier king. So this is, I've just told you this bit. And in fact, Charles also died in 1422. And the fact is that if Henry V had lived another year or two, he would have become the King of France. And I lead you to imagine what the history of Europe could have been like if that had happened. But he did. And eventually, after Henry's death and after the death of Charles VI, England gradually lost control of France because, as you probably remember, Joan of Arc came on the scene, and she was eventually captured by the Burgundians, handed over to the English and burnt at the stake. And that's the story of Henry V and the great English victory at Agincourt.
Wow.
That's a great story, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, I've got one question for you.
Go on, Steve.
You mentioned the bows, but you didn't say like what they were actually made of.
Well, they
What
were usually made of yew.
and the actual draw, the string. What did they use? Wouldn't they use string? Would they?
No, I think that was a gut of some sort.
About £100 pull, I think, wasn't it?
It was about £100 pull. Whereas a competition bow these days is probably about £45, I'd imagine.
What did the king die of at the age of 34?
Well, we think he probably died of dysentery. Not that he would have contracted that at Harfleur. That would have, I mean, dysentery was rife in the hygiene conditions of those days. Anybody actually recall seeing the film of Henry V?
I saw it in the school, like you were saying.
You saw it in 1945.
The Odeon.
Yeah, I only learned about that the other day because one of our members, Jill Fenn, said that she could remember seeing it in 1945, and I was fascinated enough to get the film. And of course the film of Henry V by Laurence Olivier, it is a straight lift from Shakespeare. So all the language is Shakespeare. Pam got fed up with it in about 5 minutes. But I sat it out and I watched the film through, and it was pretty good generally until it came to the recreation of the battle, and that wasn't particularly accurate. But it's a great. I just think it's a great story because, you know, we got this guy at Harfleur who was pretty much down and out and just looking to get away, and he still managed to nail the French.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
With all the men and the horses, what would they have eaten and how could they organise the food and the horses' food? How would they
Well, I
organise
think they had to try and buy it as they went, but I don't suppose the attitude of the French was.
What was the diet back in?
Well, French is easy. Horses are easy because that's hay, isn't it?
But they would have had to carry some food with them.
They would have carried what they could, and don't forget that, as I said, they left Harfleur with more horses than men. So carrying the stuff wouldn't have been a problem. Finding it and buying it would have been a problem because I don't suppose the local population were helpful.
Right.
Probably eat the horses if they ate.
Hokey cokey. Next month is our good friend Eamon. And Eamon is going to talk to us about the age of highwaymen in Surrey and England generally. And he tells me he thinks highway women.
Yes.
So we're going to have a talk next month about highway persons. One other thing, just before we pack up, Richard Cooper, who some of you may know, his funeral is tomorrow morning at 11:45 at the Creme. Anybody who knew him or would like to come is very welcome. And the other thing, as a result of poor Richard's death, is the fact that Richard was a custodian of an enormous amount of material in his home, which didn't belong to, but will come to, the History Society. And we have to find a home for it. Now, many of you helped earlier on this year when we did an audit of the archives, which we've got in David Morgan's garage. Now, to accommodate what is in Richard's house, we've got to have a tidy up of what's in David's garage and try our best to fit what comes from Richard's house into the garage. So my appeal is simply this: if you or anybody you know has got any sort of available storage, be it a decent sized shed or a garage that we could possibly have the use of, we would be very, very interested to know about it. And if any of you are in that position, please let us know. Otherwise, thank you for coming this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all next month.